And I've got the honor of introducing the keynote speaker for our 2022 virtual conference. It's the theme of access and equity. And I'll tell you, our speaker could not be a better fit to kick off our conference. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Cassandra Johnson-Gaither as the keynote. And I'm going to say a few things about her. We had a conversation last week, and I really enjoyed talking to Cassandra. I've known her and known of her for I think for most of her professional career, the past 20 years or so. And it's really fun to be able to talk with her. Her always ever-present sense of humor always makes me smile, along with her creative ideas. But Dr. Johnson refers to herself as an inadvertent scholar. In her own view, the opportunities of life have seemed to unfold in front of her without any planning or seeking out on her part. For example, she had no intentions of becoming a research social scientist for the USDA Forest Service. This is a position she's had for the past 2 decades, focused on issues of race, leisure, and natural resources. Earning her degrees in sociology from the University of Georgia at Athens, and also being fluent in the German language. She originally set out on a research agenda to learn more about Afro-German women who are recognized as being African, yet making a life for themselves in Germany. Dr. Johnson was curious to understand ways in which racism was enacted and framed in the German culture. She took a sideways turn and ended up working for the USDA Forest Service to understand people's use and non-use of natural resources, particularly for African-American communities. A career highlight for her has been her research focused on land tenure in the southern part of the US. Where land tenure is passed for generations of a family, yet there's no written record or title to indicate they actually own the land. This is referred to as heirs property. And I've tripped over the silent H on heirs a lot, so I'm actually going to put this in the chat here, this heirs property, along with a citation that one of hers, just to explain what heirs property is about. Heirs property is a pattern of handing down land that has led to generational poverty due to the inability to secure loans and lack of incentives to make improvements. One owns the land, yet there are still issues with legal standing and land tenure. Her research has indicated that such problems are concentrated within populations of African-American landowners, Native American families, and families who live in Appalachia. In her modest ways and with her good humor, Dr. Johnson suggests she's still not sure what her job responsibilities entail, or even if she's conducted the types of research desired by her agency. Dr. Johnson's path is definitely a one of a kind, with no pre-formulated strategy of direction on her journey. Even though looking back, she has total direction, but I guess in the process and that lived experience as she tells it, it was one of no strategy of moving forward. Her advice to others, and this is really my interpretation of her advice, I'll let her write this if I'm wrong on it, but I'm going to say that when she talks about and she shares her wisdom, her advice to others might be about having the courage to create your own path, one that fits what you care about, one that you can nurture the spirit and determination for yourself to step outside of boundaries that otherwise would push you down a fairly well-worn path. So we're honored here to have Dr. Johnson share insights today with her talk entitled White Voices in Black Spaces. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Exactly. You're doing well.
Okay.
And we can see your slides too, Cassandra.
Okay, awesome. Right. Yeah, I guess I'm sort of surprised to hear you reflect back what we talked about last Friday. I didn't know that I had given you the impression that my career so far, my career as it emerged was so kind of willy-nilly. I didn't mean to give exactly that impression, but anyway, I hope folks can take that a little bit with tongue in cheek. It's been a great career with the USDA Forest Service. It certainly has. I'd like to start out, let me start out with a very big thank you to IASNR. and to Jessica Hill and the planning committee in particular for the invitation to address this year's conference. As Bill sort of indicated, I have a pretty fairly long history with the organization with IASNR through years of presenting papers at conferences. And I can really say without hesitation that these experiences have really been key to my growth and maturity as a researcher. So I thank you all for that as well as the invitation to speak today. I was asked to talk about access and equity as this relates to natural resources and the environment. And this is actually a topic that I started looking at back in graduate school, when I was in graduate school in the 1990s. And back then for me, I thought about access and equity in terms of outdoor recreation and leisure activities in the settings where this took place. At that time, I was, and I still am really sort of intrigued by the question of why so few African Americans visit wildland areas for recreation. You know, this question is especially relevant, I think, for the US South, given the very large percentages of Blacks who live near some national forests and other public lands in the region. So one useful way, I think, to frame this question and others relating to access and equity is to think about them in terms of environmental justice. Pretty common concept and term, I think, worldwide. And so environmental justice is typically defined as the fair treatment and involvement of people in decisions about environmental outputs and planning, regardless of the background that people bring with them. So I think this definition addresses a couple of things that most people probably think about when they think about environmental justice. So it addresses what's fair in terms of the allocation of both environmental goods and bads. And so this is what's referred to generally as the sort of the distributive aspect or distributive dimension of environmental justice. And then another key term in that definition, that very short definition that I just shared, is involvement. And that has to do with environmental justice communities making meaningful decisions about what gets produced in the first place. So this is what's sort of referred to as the procedural aspect of environmental justice. And this is really about ensuring that environmental justice communities defined in the US context as minorities, racial, ethnic minorities, and lower wealth groups, making sure that these groups, these EJ communities and folks, that they have a seat, so to speak, at the table, you know, and that they can really participate in a real way, not just in a token way, but in a real way in the decision-making process when it comes to the distribution or the production of environmental goods or services. But then there's a third dimension to EJ, or a third component, and this is what's called recognition justice. And so this more recently articulated component of environmental justice, it comes out of the scholarship on the recognition of group difference. And it relates to what the social theorist Nancy Fraser labeled back in the 1990s. She called it the politics of recognition. And for Nancy at that time, this sort of recognition justice was overtaking notions of justice that had to do with the redistribution of goods across society. Okay, but so recognition justice, it sort of goes against notions of, say, a colorblind society that might be devoid of any kind of really salient heterogeneity. Recognition justice is much more than just acknowledging, say, structural inequities. Okay, we know there are differences along those fronts, but rather it's about recognizing actually the agency, say that minoritized groups, for example, that they might bring to a discussion. So extending this recognition of difference, so that whole concept to environmental justice, this means that in order for environmental justice to be more fully realized, mainstream, say, let's call them dominant groups, they have to allow for the different ways, say, that let's say, minority groups engage with nature. So the majority has to be willing to concede, say, some intellectual space to accept that what the marginalized bring to a discussion, their ontology or their world view of nature and environment, it may actually be at odds with conventional thinking about what constitutes an environmental bad or good. And so other scholars have, really urged, though, a little bit of caution here, that recognition justice, it doesn't at all replace the distributive dimension of environmental justice or procedural justice. Those still apply. Those are very valid. But this recognition piece needs to be added to environmental justice. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about a case study where I think recognition justice applies. And this is in the US state of Georgia, so in metropolitan Atlanta. Okay. So there's an effort underway right now in South Metro Atlanta to create what the promoters are calling the South River Forest. And so this proposed forest, so this is in a highly urbanized area, essentially in Atlanta, right? Okay. So this proposed forest, it would be composed or comprised of non-contiguous green spaces that span 2 jurisdictions, which include the city of Atlanta and neighboring DeKalb County, okay? And so these disparate pieces of green space would be linked by some kind of path or trail system, I think, if this whole forest is established. But it's not exactly clear to me how those connections would be made, but I think that's the idea there, functionally. So the South River Forest boundaries, they're still not settled, but the perimeters or the parameters so far are depicted roughly here by the red polygon here. This is Atlanta, DeKalb County, red polygon here, and that's this polygon here enlarged. So this image here on the farthest right is a snapshot of a spot in the Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve that's in the Atlanta portion of the proposed forest. So if you look here at the map in the middle, this little green star here, this is the approximate location of this spot here. This is about where I was when I took this photo about a month ago. So this concept of this forest within the city of Atlanta, it came out of the city of Atlanta planning process called the Atlanta City Design back in 2017. And the whole sort of impetus behind this concept of this conservation effort is really, the idea here is, the conservation or preservation of, really ecologically important and rich green spaces in Metro Atlanta. And this is in anticipation of huge population increases in coming decades. This is a very ambitious plan that encompasses about 3,500 acres, and that's about, I guess, about 1,400 hectares of land. And of this 3,500 acres of land, about 700 acres is actually green space. So about 280 hectares is actually green space. And some of this green space has canopy and is more forest-like, and others is just kind of an open area. Okay, so about 700 acres of green space. The remaining 2,800 acres or so is developed. It's either in commercial or industrial or residential uses right now. But the idea eventually, planners hope that they'd be able to purchase some of those developed areas and repurpose them or reclaim them for the forest area. And so I think plans were proceeding, they were, proceeding as pretty much as expected for this vision. It's been led by the Nature Conservancy of Georgia and also a group that formed to help realize this vision called the South River Forest Coalition. And then I think in about 2019 or so, there was some sort of talk sort of began about a land exchange between a movie studio owner and DeKalb County, so that municipality or that jurisdiction, okay? Then in about early 2021, DeKalb County, it actually agreed to exchange or swap 40 acres of one of the canopied green spaces, that would be included in the proposed forest area. And this is a portion of a county-owned park, nothing fancy here, just a county-owned park called Entrenchment Creek Park. So owned by the county. So what happened was that 40 acres of a public park owned by DeKalb County were traded for 53 acres owned by a movie studio. And that movie studio is also within this proposed forested area. And just an FYI, this sort of came as a surprise to me. I'm Georgia born and raised, but the movie industry in Georgia is a huge deal. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it really rivals movie making in Hollywood. I think Georgia made the most feature films, more feature films than Hollywood did. It makes more feature films than Hollywood does, okay? So now in exchange for this 40 acres of mostly forested patch, it's mostly canopy cover. So in exchange for that, the county gets 53 acres of land that critics say is mostly degraded. But some of that 53 acres is slated to be turned into a county park. It even has a name. It's going to be called the Michelle Obama Park. And it's supposed to contain some trails, but also a number of developed features like playgrounds, ball fields, I think some kind of water splash area, that kind of thing that you see kids, going through in summertime. And I think it's supposed to be compliant with the American Disabilities Act. So what you would have here, what the supporters of this project, what they're really excited about is that you would have an ADA, that's American Disabilities Act, compliant outdoor recreation space, especially with children in mind, which advocates, they really see this as a huge win. So you got a whole lot more developed features compared to that 40 acres of mostly forest patch that were traded. And so this swap, it really generated a huge amount of controversy because environmentalists say the exchange is for poor quality land and that it sets a really bad precedent for further development in an area of the city that environmentalists want to see preserved. And now I don't want to get into the right and wrong of the land swap, either from an ecological argument or from a legal angle, because both of these points are really right now being really points of intense contention, actually involving a lawsuit. But I don't want to get into the right and wrong of that. But what I want to point out here is what I think are the fundamentally different ways that notions of nature engagement, and environmental quality are understood and expressed by sort of two different groups. How they are understood and expressed by what I'll call a loose affiliation of mostly white environmentalists, and then the mostly, on the other hand, on the other side, if you will, a mostly African-American population that lives in this part of the metro area. But before I go into all that, and maybe I should have started out with this because this is really important. Just a bit of background about this part of the metro area. So this area that includes this proposed South River Forest area, it's part of the ancestral homeland of the Muskogee Creek Nation or Indians. And they actually call a river that flows through this area, it's called the South River, and it was named for a family, a planter family, a white planter family called the South family, okay? But the Muskogee Creek, they call this part of what's now Metro Atlanta, they called it Weelaunee. And so some present day, activists, they really want to pay respect to that heritage. So they call this area Willani. And of course, the Muskogee, they were forcibly removed from Georgia. They were part of the thousands of indigenous people that were relocated to what was called at that time Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. So this is in the 1830s. And their removal was part of the whole Trail of Tears tragedy that was essentially an instance of genocide because so many Native people died along that track. So almost 200 years ago. But in much more recent history, this part of the metro area was built out, say in the 1950s, 1960s, via suburbanization. And then along comes integration in the 1960s, 1970s. This is racial integration. So, and this results in massive white flight. And so when I say white flight, I mean white people moving away from a community, from an area. And so Black people are moving in, and so Black people are buying these homes that white people are leaving. And they're doing this, they're moving into subdivisions on both the Atlanta and the DeKalb County side of this proposed forest vision area. And so on top of this, on top of Black people moving in and actually buying property, what you had also, say in the late 1960s and early 1970s, on the Atlanta side of this proposed forest area, you had the construction of 4 public housing projects. So this is federally subsidized housing, was known sort of like casually or colloquially as, the projects. So 4 public housing projects were located within about a 2 to 3 mile radius on the Atlanta side, which means that you suddenly had federally subsidized housing for poor people, probably 99% of whom were Black, located in the area. So I'm sure that only intensified white flight. So full disclosure here, I grew up in one of the subdivisions near this area, and so my parents bought a home in the Rebel Valley Forest, or was it Rebel Forest Valley? But anyway, in one of these subdivisions in 1971, I was a small kid, I think I was 6 years old. And I remember asking my mother a couple weeks ago, I said, when we moved here, who lived here? I said, who lived here? And she said, well, most of the people were white, but in all of my memory growing up in the 70s, early 80s, everybody was Black, so, and it's remained pretty much that way since then. And so as the Black population increased in this part of the metro area, say in the 70s or so, this was followed by economic disinvestment in both Atlanta and in the DeKalb County. And so what you had moved in to this neighborhood, and in addition to the demographics changing, what you had instead of mainstream, say, retail establishments, what you had come on site was sort of a proliferation of, say, fast food joints, liquor stores, junkyards. A couple of landfills made their way into the area. Then there was also this increasing crime rates. I don't want to blame public housing, but a lot of that was located in public housing in the 80s and 90s when crack cocaine really became an epidemic in urban areas and Black communities, really decimated some of these communities. So you had all of this going on. But maybe one good outcome of the disinvestment in this part of the metro area is that there was less development, okay? And I think this actually had the effect of preserving some green space. So what you have now in this area is sort of this uneven configuration of LULUs, locally unwanted land uses. And they're sort of juxtaposed with pretty extensive patches of canopy cover. But, few Black people really paid attention to forest cover in this part of town until whites began to move back into the city in the early 2000s. And, green space preservation or conservation, it became a thing. And so when DeKalb County approved this land exchange in 2021, it really came as a severe blow to the white environmental imagination, because whites had discovered these green areas and they were really fighting to re-image this part of town as this sort of ecological haven. So I reviewed about 30 newspaper articles covering the Entrenchment Creek land exchange or swap, as one way of trying to understand, let's call it a mainstream environmental view of Entrenchment Creek Park. And so this is a quote from a staunch supporter of the South River Forest concept. And this is a white guy, and he actually lives in the area, and I've spoken with him, great person. So towards the end of this quote, he's quoted as saying, "We really need the community to speak up and demand accountability, and a bigger discussion for that land exchange. So we really need the community to speak up." But most Black residents, they don't say much, at least publicly. And I think the lack of a very vocal and strong opposition to the land exchange among Blacks, it relates to a couple things. I think the first is the promise of some type of economic growth and investment in nearby neighborhoods that these folks have been promised. This growth would be attracted by the movie industry expanding in this area. So that's one thing, certainly. But I also think this, let's call it this sort of being mute a little bit, or this silence, or certainly not a strong opposition. I think it also has a lot to do with how Black Americans engage with nature. And this is where the recognition of, let's call it a distinct Black land ethic is important. And again, when I looked at this issue for my master's thesis at that time, I was looking for any indication of culturally specific ways that African Americans engage with nature in their leisure time. And my inquiry at that time was based on the literature at that time, especially, Randall Washburn's research from the 1970s, where he, argued that Black leisure time activities could be explained by what he called the ethnicity perspective, which holds that Black culture informs how Blacks spend their leisure time outdoors. So I was really interested in that time in trying to identify elements of this cultural approach to leisure. And what I found at that time in my own research, and also in reviewing the literature at that time, was that Black Americans' engagement with nature and the outdoors seemed to be influenced by at least three things. So the first is sort of a collectivism, if you will. So a collective orientation to being outdoors. So when Black Americans spend their leisure time outdoors, for many, I think socializing in group activities as opposed to sort of solitary activities are prioritized. And so this collective way of being sort of in nature, it may be a holdover from sort of African cultures where the collective and extended kin and clan are centered as opposed to the individual. So collectivism. Then there also seems to be a preference for developed outdoor settings, which really maybe relates to the collective piece here. So a preference for nature settings that are more manicured than, say, wild. So a preference for order rather than chaos in nature. Consider that for most of the 20th century, middle-class African Americans in particular really sought to distance themselves from the image of Blacks as linked to the land. Eldridge Cleaver, a former Black Panther, when he was a Black Panther, he wrote that achievement for Blacks was really measured in terms of how far they could distance themselves from agrarianism, from the farm. And so that was an effort then to replace, let's say, the ignoble savage with a collective presentation of the self as refined, as coiffed. And so that urbane and cityfied Black would also be situated in similar outdoor settings to the extent that that was possible. So, if you think about most Black American cultural icons, think about a Beyonce or Jay-Z, you see them, you know, dolled up, kind of the outdoors and rugged spaces are not really what they represent. And then the third thing is sort of safety concerns. And then safety, this is really multi-layered. Includes concerns about, terror, both past and present, that could be perpetuated against Blacks in the woods, lynchings, assaults, you name it. So, but also maybe trepidations about encountering wild animals. So then three things: collectivism, developed setting aesthetic, and safety is key factors in how Blacks approach nature. So my look at Black nature engagement, it was not explicitly political, but more recent scholars insist that the Black nature question be politicized. Much about what I might call a Black environmental worldview or a Black environmental aesthetic is what scholars like Abby Sine Harper from Clemson University and some of her colleagues and co-authors, they refer to as Black imaginaries of nature, that see the Black experience of nature as definitely a political project. And certainly, I think a lot of research sort of supports suggests support for kind of collective and developed setting preferences and concerns for safety in the out of doors. Okay, and this is research at different scales across time. So it's not something that's just episodic, a study at a particular time, but these are studies that have been conducted at different points in time for a number of decades. So, and one example of this empiricism is data from a survey of visitors to national forests in the South, in states like mine, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi. So since about the early 2000s, results from my agency, the agency that I work for, the USDA Forest Service. So the Forest Service's National Visitor Use Monitoring Survey, NVUM, it's a survey of visitors to national forests. And that survey, it shows still, repeatedly that African Americans make up only about 2% of visits. Only about 2% of visits to the Chattahoochee Oconee National Forest in Georgia is accounted for by African Americans. And this is despite the fact that this forest is not very far from Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, and certainly and even closer to Metro Atlanta. And so just about 50% of Atlanta's population is African American. And it's only about, maybe a little bit less than 2 hours drive away from the city. And so these kind of results are not only true for visits to the national forest in Georgia, but visits made by Blacks to all other national forests in the South show very similar figures, very low number of Blacks visiting these places, these national forests. And, this is, even the case for, where Black communities are literally located within national forest boundaries. For instance, in rural communities near the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina. So I think that forest patches like this, like the pieces that would be included in this South River Forest, I think that these forest patches within a city that mimic forested landscape, again, the same kind of forest patches that are envisioned for the South River Forest, I think Blacks are less comfortable in these spaces. And I think city Blacks especially may have trouble envisioning themselves in these spaces. And I spoke to one community member, an African-American person, who relayed this sentiment about the wooded portions of Entrenchment Creek Park. But again, I think this kind of, let's call it a distinctively Black cultural or perhaps political approach to nature has yet to be acknowledged by the environmental supporters of the South River Forest concept, and it's certainly not been brought up in the contentions around the Entrenchment Creek land swap. And so another indicator of the lack of recognition or misrecognition of how Blacks view nature is related to what I feel is, let's call it an inordinate amount of media attention that's been given to a collection of folks who call themselves defenders of the Atlanta forest. Okay, so this group mobilized initially in response to another controversy associated with another one of the green spaces that are expected to be included in this South River forest. This is the 350-acre area called the Old Atlanta Prison Farm that's contiguous with Entrenchment Creek Park. So the Old Atlanta Prison Farm is owned by the city of Atlanta. Entrenchment Creek Park is owned by DeKalb County, but they're contiguous. And so these defenders of the forest, they're against what is slated for the old prison farm, and they are also very much against this land swap. And so these folks, they've moved into the woods that are in Entrenchment Creek Park and the old prison farm, and they've been accused vandalizing property, destroying private property, throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails at police, and engaging in other acts of, let's say, civil disobedience, all ostensibly to protect the woods or the forest that's in Entrenchment Creek Park and this area that's the old prison farm. But one resident, she told me that she considered these defenders to be terrorists because of how they disrespected her community. And I guess if press reports are accurate, many of these defenders, they're from out of state, so these folks aren't actually invested in this part of the metro area. And when I say invested, I mean in terms of broader issues involving, say, affordable housing or school quality, for instance. But media reports on tensions, on these controversies about the old prison farm and the movie studio exchange, the media focus here, headlines that really typically, they really feature these defenders and their position, that's really prominent. And I know that's, because of the sensational nature of what these folks are doing. I understand that. For instance, these images here are from a Guardian article, an article that appeared in the Guardian in June of 2022, So all of these pictures are folks camped out in the woods. None of, include images of folks who live in these communities for a long time. And so, these articles, they eventually get around to saying that some community members actually support the land exchange. But, I feel like all the drama and the dress of these largely white defenders, although their faces are covered, their tactics and their representation of those tactics, I think it really sort of usurps the community's voice. And it's another very blatant example, I think, of, let's say, a non-Black environmental worldview drowning out the voices and the lived experiences of Black people. And finally, there's also no mention of how Blacks engage with nature in responses to two questions to an online survey that South River Forest supporters are collecting to gauge the public's perception and attitudes about this whole South River Forest concept. And so I did really an informal search of keywords in response to two questions on that survey. And so a prompt asked the respondent about respondents' impressions of the whole area, not just the natural features in the area, but this prompt included just a little bit of information about the social and economic challenges in this part of the metro area. And they also talked about the environmental features of this area, which I thought was really good. So they tried to, that prompt tried to sort of present a more holistic sort of representation of the South River Forest area. It's about nature, environment, and preservation, of course, but it's also about the socioeconomics of this area. So I like that prompt. And so this chart here combines responses to these two questions. And I think there are about 260 responses. And so these two questions, what does the South River Forest area mean to you? And how would you describe your relationship to it? And I need to say that this is not any kind of official data. You know, I'm not, data have not been shared with me, but this is just what I've been able to download from the webpage. And so these, the data that I downloaded, the comments that I downloaded may not represent the official data or the official count. So I saw about 260 responses, but I was at a meeting last month related to this whole effort, and someone from the organization that's administering the survey, which is the Atlanta Regional Commission, they said that they had 500 responses so far. So that's way more than the 260 responses that I was able to see. So just want to say that I may not have all of the data here, but this is what I see online, and this is what anybody would see online if they went to the survey to respond to it. And so I'm not at all surprised that some of the most frequently mentioned terms have to do with the importance of nature preservation and to some extent, outdoor recreation, activities like hiking and biking. But what I see not mentioned so often, or what I see are terms that have to do with broader concepts of environmental justice, such as economic development, anything having to do with concerns about crime or poverty or school quality. I don't see those terms so much in these responses. But these things, these are concerns, these are priorities for community organizations in this part of the metro area that, that don't center the environment and nature. And so I was also, and I am also very interested in who is responding to this survey. So, when I scroll, or anybody, when you scroll down to the, towards the end of the survey, you can see the demographic section of the survey. You can see who has responded, and they asked about race, ethnicity, age, gender, and so on and so on. So in terms of those demographics, you can see, anybody can see who's commenting. And so, it's pretty clear that about nearly 80% of respondents are white and just about 9% are Black, and these numbers compare to a population proportion in this part of the metro area that's nearly the inverse of the sample proportion. It's about 82% of the people who live in this part of the metro area are Black and about 13% are white. So it's also very interesting that in an area that's majority Black and has been for decades, there's hardly any mention of the Black population, the Black people that live there, and concerns that they routinely contend with. But what I do see in these 260 comments or so are 4 more mentions of the indigenous people who haven't lived in this space for nearly 200 years. And so finally, I want to say, I think the larger effort to, I'll call it rebrand this area in environmental or ecological terms, is in some ways representative of a settler mentality, because I think it seeks to sort of subdue or homogenize the different human communities that are included in this part of the metro area, sort of seeks to sort of subdue them under the guise of sort of an all-encompassing ecological framing. But, this area is not, some terra nullius, I don't think the South River Forest effort has done a sufficient job of acknowledging the distinct identities of communities that comprise this area. For example, it's very important to recognize that Black Atlantans, especially, they see themselves as belonging to the city and its very rich Black history rather than to sort of a nebulous metro Atlanta area. And while most of the neighborhoods in the proposed forest area, they were, established for whites, as, all white communities that were segregated racially in the post-war area. era. But two of these neighborhoods on the Atlanta side, two of these communities, one's called Norwood Manor and the other Thomasville Heights. Both of these neighborhoods, they were named for, established for, and by Blacks in the early 20th century, and the older folks who lived there, whose parents were instrumental in this establishment, they were very proud of the agency that was exhibited by their foreparents. And there's recorded oral histories of these communities that was collected by a Georgia State University researcher. And after I came across these oral histories, I was really excited, and I suggested to some promoters of the South River Forest concept that they listen to these stories to get a better sense of this area's history. But I don't know if that's been done. And again, a good amount of attention has been given to recognizing the area's indigenous sort of beginnings, which is fantastic, fully supportive of that. That needs to happen, that must happen. I just wish a similar kind of energy were put into recognizing the late 20th century human inhabitants of this place and their struggles, okay? And so another kind of, I guess, example for me of kind of this settler mentality relates to this. So these South River Forest promoters, they've suggested including a historically African-American cemetery in the South River Forest boundary area. Now, this hasn't been actually done. It's not included yet. It's only been suggested, okay? Now, this is what's called the South View Cemetery. It's where Martin Luther King Jr.'s, his remains, they were initially interred. And there are also the remains of a whole lot of other Black Atlanta, like influential folks, business people, educators, sports figures, and so on. And there are also, but most of the folks there are probably just ordinary folks. My father's remains, they're actually there. And my best friend from when I was growing up in school, her father was buried there just about a month or so ago. So it's still very much an active burial place, this South View Cemetery. And so I think because of this history and the way that Black people view cemeteries as sacred places, somewhat like, but certainly not the same as, I don't want to appropriate that, but somewhat like how Native Americans view burial places, these places where Blacks are, places of reverence and remembrance. They're separated from the ordinary, set apart physically. So if connecting this South View Cemetery with this South River Forest, if this means, constructing some type of pedestrian or bike pathways and, along with all the kind of traffic that would bring, people coming into these spaces for essentially sort of leisure and recreation or, fitness training or whatever. If that's what it means, I'm not sure if that really meshes with Black culture. I'm not sure if that would not be an affront to the history and the legacy of this sacred place. So in conclusion, I want to stress that my point is certainly not to say that Blacks don't support conservation or preservation because they don't go to the woods. They do go to the woods. They certainly go to the woods. If you think about groups like Outdoor Afro, for instance, that have chapters in a number of different places across the country, including Atlanta. And also with respect to the South River Forest vision area, to connect these contiguous, spaces. There are certainly some Blacks in this part of Metro Atlanta who are huge champions of this effort, Although one community member who was very involved in getting Lake Charlotte established, she also relayed to me that most of the people that she's seen visiting Lake Charlotte right now are white, but she's seen some increases in Black folks visiting, and she hopes that those numbers would increase. So again, I don't want to say that Blacks are against nature and that they're scared to go to the woods. They certainly do go to the woods. And then just in closing, I'll also take this opportunity to play a little bit of devil's advocate, and this is related to the recognition of difference concept. I think for me, as I'm sort of getting into this literature, I have to ask myself, are there, say, logical limits in recognizing, say, different environmental worldviews? I believe strongly that nature cannot, should not, must not disappear in any attempt to be just, and I think that the equitable experience of nature, it also has to mean that nature must remain. So nature, environment, it has to survive any attempts that would include others. And so with that, I'll end and I'll see if there are any questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Cassandra, for that interesting talk. I mean, I like the way you wove aspects of your own life, your family and person into a really interesting sort of discussion of the ideas of nature, Blacks in the city of Atlanta and their parks. Hey, we've got a number of hands that are up. Cassandra, you probably can see them as well as I. Does someone?
Would that be in the chat then?
Well, I thought I saw some hands up, maybe not. I guess I would say if you've got questions for Cassandra, please raise your hand. You can put them in the chat. I can read them. I think we have Felicitas. Looks like your hand is up. Do you want to be the first one off?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I'm just trying to change the view and also, yeah, so that Cassandra can see me and hear me. Well, Cassandra, thanks a lot for this presentation. It's really rich and very informative. I've enjoyed it. I have many questions, but the one I'm really thinking about focuses on where you're talking about the survey. The survey, you got a portion of the survey results, and you're just showing who had responded to that survey. And there was a very small proportion of Black people in relation to actually the population of the area. And what I'm wondering is, first of all, if we want to know what not only Black people, but people of color or other groups think, it's important to actually get to them, get them to respond. So based on your experience, what can we do to get these people to actually take part in these conversations and to respond, to surveys about areas where they live and that are really of importance to them? Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much for that question. Is that Felicitas? Did we meet in Germany?
Yes, we did.
This is my sister from Germany. I still have this photograph where the several of us were there in the photograph, and I'm still very much in touch with Rita. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'll email you.
Okay, thank you for that comment. No, that's a very good, very relevant comment. So this survey is just one of a couple different ways that these folks are trying to get community input. And I need to say that I believe they are sincere in their efforts in trying to get more responses, but it's been difficult. And I think one of the issues here has to do with the demographics. So this part of the city is majority African-American. This part of Atlanta is majority African-American. And there are also more older people, in fact, more elderly people in this part of the city. And what I've been told directly by two community leaders is that these folks are leery, they're weary, they're a little bit suspicious of outsiders coming in and proposing things. So they are reluctant they certainly are not going to go online and interface with a survey online. They're also somewhat reluctant to show up in public at some of the community input meetings that have been arranged. you know, I was at one of these community input meetings like about a month ago, and this was something that you know, I just wondered about this effort as well. That was a sincere effort by the folks running the meeting to get people's sort of views on environmental justice. What does that mean to you? And so there were kind of three kind of options that people could select if they wanted to say, well, this is what environmental justice means. It means dot, dot, dot. And one of those options was carbon offsetting. So I'm sitting there and I'm going, you know, I've been around natural resources, this whole community for years, and I'm still not exactly sure what carbon offsetting is, of course. And, you know, and so, you know, I kind of raised my hand. I didn't respond to the survey because I'm supposed to be a fly on the wall there, but I said, well, you know, can you tell us what carbon offsetting is? And the woman with the microphone, she had to think a minute about what that meant. So if you're asking a 70-year-old person or a 25-year-old white person, just sort of your ordinary citizen, to consider whether a construct or concept like carbon offsetting is important for environmental justice, I think there are some missing links there. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Felicitas. That was an interesting question that you brought out here. Yes, we've got another question here from John Jambo-Kai Dakwa.
Yeah, yeah, Cassandra. Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation. I came in late, but I was struck by as the slide that you had presented that focus on factors that inform African American engagement with nature's spaces, nature engagement. And I was wondering, with this knowledge, you talk about collectivism, preference for developed area settings, and then safety concerns. And I wanted to take that conversation further and ask, so how do we, with this knowledge of knowing what informs engagement, how can we take this knowledge to improve the way African American can engage? Like how would it inform in terms of practice and programming? In what way can these factors inform the way we design to help engagement, especially to with concerns about like justice and access to spaces, especially in the context of nature-based adaptation and all that? In what ways can these factors inform the way we design programming to enhance engagement?
Okay. Can I share my screen? Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
So I mentioned in my talk that there are groups like there's one particular group called Outdoor Afro. And so this is a Black-centered group that purposely engages with nature for recreation. And I think it came out of kind of a whole social media, when social media really became prominent and really exploded. I think the person who founded the group, her name is Rue Mapp out of California. She, a Black woman, she liked to hike and bike and trek through nature. And so via social media, she started just putting prompts or messages out there asking if folks wanted to meet up and do the same kind of things. So from those efforts, this group Outdoor Afro was created and has these chapters across the US, including in Atlanta. And so I think efforts like this is a way to engage Blacks with nature. There's another much less talked about group in the metro area. And this group is also one that goes out and does intense hikes and things like that in nature. But this is really centered for older people. And the woman who created this group, she told me that one distinctive aspect of how these folks, as Black folks, how they go out into the woods is they go out in groups. They do group hikes. They do a whole lot more kind of interacting and socializing when they're in the woods. So this may seem like a slight difference or subtle difference, but I think it's important enough to start building experiences that African Americans feel more comfortable with.
Yeah, thank you. If I can follow up quickly on another question in that. So I see the examples that you gave are all sort of bottom-up approaches by individuals that are building these, that are also exploiting to not just local, but also national. But it's how about from a policy side, in terms of how does that inform the way we design public policy to make these places safe and open for everyone? Can these findings in any way inform the way we design?
Yeah, I don't know about the design aspect. I don't know about that. There was a good amount of work that was done, I think, in the Southern California area over the past couple of decades, looking at Hispanic or Latinx communities and how they tended to recreate in the forest. And similar to how Black folks like to go out in collectives with larger groups, from a design standpoint, managers of national forests in that part of the country, to some extent, were able to redesign, develop, say, camping areas in a way that would accommodate larger groups of people. So that's one thing that could happen. With my organization, there is much more talk about facilitating, say, this is not really a policy, but starting to facilitate outings that are focused on getting Black people out into the woods. So it starts maybe with like just these activities where the focus is having Black people come to the woods and being sort of guided to do some of the activities, like maybe doing some type of snorkeling in freshwater streams, for example. That's one way, but I think it has to be a two-way. It can't just be sort of some official organization, a top-down kind of imposition of information about the correct or traditional way, if you will, to engage with nature. There has to be some receiving of information from the groups that are being targeted. So yeah. But from a policy, yeah, that's a really interesting plan. And I don't think my agency, at least, I don't think we're not that far down the road where there is some talk about changing policy or management style to perhaps accommodate a distinctively Black outdoor recreation style. We are not there. The National Park Service has done a lot of that in terms of the memorials that they have to like people of color, and their sites, many of their sites are in more urban places, that you can visit, but the same kind of thing has not happened with the U.S. Forest Service.
Thank you.
Cassandra, I have a question that takes off from where John just asked you. I too liked your sort of Black land ethic, the way you presented it. I thought that was really interesting and seems like I'd not come across that. So that was quite cool stuff. As a question I wanted to link that back to his question about policy. You started off your talk with the notion of recognition justice. And I was wondering if you see recognition justice as being somehow that we need policy that would embody some aspect of recognition justice in sort of engaging African-American Blacks with nature.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, as a researcher in my organization, we are required to really stay out of the policy realm. You go out and you do your research and you share it, but the formulation of policy, perhaps in response to some findings, is the purview of others. So I have not thought more deeply about the policy aspects of a distinct Black land ethic and where that would fall. I think the Yeah, I'll just say that. So I can't really speak to policy. And of course, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? So that's where, change comes. But I have seen many more overtures, and I guess you could say informally, certainly, first of all, an acknowledgement or recognition that relatively few Blacks visit national forests. So that's the first step in, saying that, well, why aren't more Blacks visiting, and what might we be able to do about that? So that's the first step. And then there's also efforts that the Forest Service is trying to piggyback on. One of these things is called, I think the Forest Service has, they may have some type of arrangement or some type of agreement with Outdoor Afro, and they may have that. And then I think the Forest Service is also trying to participate in an effort called Get Black Outside by hosting visitation events on national forests. But I don't know how that moves us in a policy direction, though. I don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, other questions for Cassandra? You can either put your questions in the chat there, or you can speak out. Please.
I'll just jump in and talk. Hi, my name is Farron. I'm with U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Annapolis, Maryland. And one of the challenges that I think that I am running into in community engagement here is we don't have the staff who look like the communities that we're trying to engage. And so for me, it feels like a lot of our collaboration or engagement attempts are a little bit of this like white savior syndrome kind of thing. Like it comes across, for me, it doesn't land well. It doesn't feel like that's the right way to approach engaging these communities. And I don't know how to fix that. I don't know how to address that when we simply don't have the staff who look like you, who have your life experience. I know there's no easy answer.
Yeah, I'm a little bit old school when it comes to that whole kind of quip, and I may get some hate mail here, but I don't necessarily think people have to look like, I have a bit of a problem with that, first of all. But I think what's really important is tenure, time and place in being with a community for a sufficient amount of time to really understand the broader issues that are going on. And I'm not sure how it is with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but I do know with the Forest Service, almost by design, positions rotate fairly quickly. So you might have somebody in a position for a while, for a year or two or three, and then they move. And so if a community has been engaging with a certain personality or a certain person for a couple of years, and they're sort of first just getting started, then that position's it's vacant, or there's nobody there to keep the momentum going, I think that's a problem. But I also think this is really a strong point or important point here for me, is that I think that it's really important for organizations to get a sense of what existing priorities are in a community. What are they already continuing with that don't have anything to do with what I think might make their place better? Is it tree planting? Maybe, maybe not. Is it some other issues associated with, quality housing or school? It's not that my organization is going to mission creep and fix that, but trying to understand where a given intervention might fit within the context of everything that community is contending with. You respect the place, you respect, the sort of the condition of like what you find when you get there. Not that it means that, folks or communities ought to be stagnant and mired in and not be able to improve, but you understand the context of the place rather than imposing what it is that you think might improve conditions. So, you know, with Fish and Wildlife Service, not sure how it is. You tell me, what do you think? Are people able to stay in place and engage with communities, no matter who it is, no matter how they look? I think I've worked with some groups who maybe sort of share that sentiment that you say they don't look like me, but I think what's more important with these folks is that they feel that somebody is coming with a sincere effort, and they are not overlooking what they're already doing. So I'll be quiet.
No, I love that perspective, and it hits on the relationship building, and in working with some of the NGOs and some of the other conservation partners in this part of the watershed, they struggle with, well, how they come to me and they're like, well, how do we get these communities to buy into what we want to do? And I try to reframe that and tell them we're coming at it backwards. How can what the community needs, how can you reframe what you're doing, or think about what you're doing or in the context? So I'll give you an example. So recently we went up to Hines National Wildlife Refuge, and Lamar Gore gave us a tour. He's doing some of these pollinator corridors in some urban areas in Philadelphia. And a long story short was he spent time sitting in just community meetings that didn't have anything to do with pollinators or plants or critters or anything. and listen to what some of the needs were of that community: a quiet space, a space to read a book, something like that. And then they were able to work and find some vacant lots. And now this program is kind of really rolling, and it's fascinating. But I think that's just really hard for some NGOs or some groups to wrap their head around, that they can't go in with what they want to do. They need to understand what the community needs. And it might not be, you're right, it might be what I think of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There are other things that are a precedent to them or more important to them, but they were able to create community gardens and these places where people can go and sit a book and have a cup of coffee that used to be a vacant lot or something like that. Then you can start to work in, oh, well, these are native plants, and these are the critters that come to the native plants, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Takes time, and
Yeah,
I am at a disadvantage as a researcher, because I don't even work with the arm of my organization that can come in and provide funding for projects, whether it's some type of funding for tree planting or funding maybe for some type of capital project. I'm a researcher, so I have to scratch my head and struggle. If I go to these people and they say, so what is it that you want? You want some saliva, you want some urine, you want my thoughts, then you go away and my condition hasn't changed. So, even from a kind of moral or ethical standpoint, I am not always, I think, maybe in the best position. So maybe I'd love to be in the shoes of somebody who could actually bring programming.
Yeah. Fascinating. There's a lot to think about.
Sandra, one of the groups that you'd identified as associated with the area that you were studying was the Native American tribes. And they seem to have some similar problems in terms of how they're represented and their lack of voice in these decisions. I'm wondering if you just talk a little bit about, they sort of, is there any coalition going between Native Americans and African Americans, as well as other sort of unrepresented populations?
So I don't think there are a whole lot of Native Americans who live in the area right now, but I think about a year ago, some members of the Muskogee Creek were invited to this area to do, I think, a ceremonial dance in recognition of their heritage there. And there was an attempt there to try to understand the intertwined histories of Blacks and Native people in this area. But that's a lot, that intersection was so long ago. I think one of the important things, and maybe healing things, if you will, that was brought out about that is this sort of very intricate and complicated history of those interactions. Okay, so you had Native people who lived in this area, who lived in this part of Georgia, who were removed. Those Native people, some of them also owned slaves. And some of those slaves were removed with the Native people, areas, territories west of the Mississippi. But then you have, African American. There's a history of African Americans being complicit in the genocide of Native people. Think about the Buffalo Soldiers, who were very instrumental in that effort and helping to, ensure that white settlers were able to go into this Indian territory. So, but that all of those sort of interactions happened a long time ago. And I guess more recently, there's been sort of some talk about Native Americans and their resistance to recognize some of the descendants of these Black people who were affiliated with their tribes, to recognize them in some type of, to give them some type of Native status. And I'm not exactly sure what that was. So more than anything, sort of the contentious history, if you will, between these two groups has sort of been unearthed through this effort. Residing in very much in Metro Atlanta. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like your idea of healing, of a healing concentration or healing gardens.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that needs to happen. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
There's something you just said about, I lost the words, about the history and the connection between those two groups. And something that I experienced recently was working with some Native communities here to write a grant. And there were 3 tribes I was working with, and they didn't want to work together. And so we go into thinking, okay, so Native Americans are a monolith, so all Native Americans are going to want to work together. These 3 local tribes close to each other in the landscape did not want to work together. And so it's something for us to keep in the back of our minds and not assume that it is a monolith, or just because they're Native American, they're going to want to work together, that kind of thing. Yeah, there's a lot of healing to be done on a lot of levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, other questions here or comments you'd like to make about the conversation? Yeah, another question here from John, please.
Yeah, it's not really a question, but a comment. And I don't really intend to take you back, but the question I was asking in relation to what is the ideal way? Is it that we need people who look like me to be there, or is it where you engage? And I feel that it's not either this or this, and I think that both are needed. With my little experience in little policy circles, sometimes if you're in the room, we all come with different experiences. And I think it affects the way we look at things. And so in as much as how we do it matters, I think who is in the room also matters. We come with different lenses. And that is why sometimes it's important to also look at who is part of the conversation, who is there. It doesn't just affect the way they engage, but the lens in which they look at the issues are completely different. And I think that is why we need both to be part of the conversation in terms of how we look at these issues. And I thought I should just mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my point as well. But it's like in response to my the response I gave to Felicitas, it's been a bit difficult to get some of these folks to voice an opinion for various reasons, maybe because they're not familiar with the interface to provide that information, or because they're just done with it. They're not interested in being a part. And maybe this passivity comes from what? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that is a real challenge. It's another challenge a little in terms of it's a confluence of factors, but and I don't know how to do that and how that can be done. But I think that is a real challenge that needs to be recognized in that whole debate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for any one particular person, but there's also sort of a little bit of maybe something related to just not wanting to work with a so-called white agenda. You know, that's what white folks want, and we just don't want to be a part of it. I mean, that's a little bit, I think, of what might be going on here. So, and you know, that and maybe for somebody who's not familiar with the US South, it seems a little sort of counterintuitive or something like that, but it's part and parcel of sort of the whole history of this part of the country. So.
Yeah, well, Cassandra, thank you so much for your time here today and sharing your wisdom. You've hit on so many a lot of interesting topics and talking points, and I think for many of us, sometimes these can be difficult topics to bring up and to have public conversation about. And you do it with such grace and sort of creativity. It's much appreciated. Why don't we give one last round of applause to Cassandra? And our next talk will be at noon then. Yeah.
Okay.
So
thank you all so much. This has been great. Thank you, Bill. And I hope that you guys have a great conference and hope to see you in Seattle next year or Portland.
Yeah, Portland, Maine.
Oh, Portland, Maine.
Yeah, Portland, Maine. Right.
Oh, I thought it was Oregon. Oh, Portland, Maine. That's just up the coast.
Yeah, it's just up the coast from you. Yeah, Portland, Maine, June 11th through 15th is next year's face-to-face conference for IASNR. We hope to see you there, Cassandra. It'd be great to see you once again.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So long, everybody. Bye-bye.